I'm going to borrow and paraphrase from Dereja Limehu, who's the executive director of the Global Alliance for Tax Justice Network, Global Tax Justice, who very famously says that if you're not on the table or at the table, you're on the menu. And so the question of the IMF and World Bank spring and annual meetings poses this very complicated dilemma for us as civil society organizations, particularly those from the continent. And given the background and the context that Emma has set, I have a few slides which will try and build on that. And I won't take too much time, be very quick on this. So I think first and foremost, the arguments for why the IMF and the World Bank, of course, they talk about technical. Our government would say, well, we need technical assistance because we don't have that in our ministries, our departments, our agencies. So therefore, their argument is, we need that technical assistance. And so, when you're engaging in these annual and spring meetings, one of the important things you get to learn and get to understand is how technical assistance is designed. And this is, pretty much through the political economy analysis through which they analyze our problems on the continent and therefore then provide solutions. And so the technical assistance that the IMF and the World Bank propose is largely market-based. It's largely about deregulation, de-risking, and about private sector, promoting private sector. On this last part on private sector, I need to be very clear. It's foreign private sector, not domestic private sector. So, the fiscal consolidation, the austerity, the deregulation, the relaxation of taxation rules or taxation rates is pretty much there to encourage foreign direct investment into our economy. So that technical assistance for our governments is argued to be very important, and therefore, we need to be involved in and participate very actively in paying very close attention to the type of technical assistance that is being advised to our governments from the IMF and the World Bank, because that's the biggest defense that our governments use. And we've seen very clearly that the technical assistance that's being provided actually is not working. Given the last few statistics that Emma has shared with us. The second reason why our governments, say that we need to engage with the IMF and the World Bank is that these two institutions help them catalyze and leverage international capital and finance. The IMF, as Emma said, is considered to be the police of the global economic system. And so many of our governments feel that if we have an IMF program, we can actually go to international capital markets and say, look, we have the IMF trusts us, our macroeconomic stability is in a particular way, and therefore, we can actually borrow from international capital markets. So we need to, again, with that sort of mindset, be very careful with the type of language that is being used. We need to engage and not sit back and just allow our governments to use the IMF to just borrow uncontrollably, borrow unsustainably, because as we've seen in many instances, the debt that we take on sometimes is not used for the right things, but then the cost of that debt is actually being transferred to citizens in the form of regressive taxation, reduction in investments in public services, and so on. The last point that is often used is about scaling up finance, and this is particularly used by the World Bank and the World Bank team. As Emma said, the World Bank is comprised of 5 agencies. There's the IDA, International Development Assistance Association, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, this form the World Bank, and then you've got the group, which includes the International Finance Corporation, IFC, the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, and the International Center for Settlements and Disputes. So collectively, having those agencies plus the IMF, our governments are often convinced that if they borrow, they can use that to scale up finance for their development projects. But little do we know that a lot of that finance, number one, tends not to be free. A lot of it, even what used to be under IDA, the IDA, in the form of grants, has now been termed as concessional loans, which is, yes, lower than market rates, but still a loan nonetheless. A lot of that finance doesn't reach our capitals or our countries because most of it is being used to pay service fees for international businesses that are going to be implementers for development projects. So when we engage in these IMF World Bank spring and annual meetings, it's important for us to be able to distinguish between the language that's been put in the public domain as progressive, as developer focused, as transformative, to the actual minutiae of detail that is contained in those agreements, that is contained within those project documents. And I think a very fundamental point here, and it's what Emma said, is that very little of it actually contains things around human rights, around public participation, around environmental protection, around the rule of law, and around working within our domestic policies, our domestic legislation. Because the attractiveness of technical assistance, of being able to get money, being able to scale up your finance and your development projects, and clouds the judgment of many of our African governments, and we sort of give them a blank check when it comes to the policy and legal framework. So very important for us to understand that. What has been the impact, and I think this is extremely important for us to understand, is that we've been engaged in the IMF and World Bank for over half a century. These institutions have been in existence for close to 1 century, 80 years, and this is the result of what the continent looks like as of today. Most of the continent is in a situation of high risk or in debt distress. We have countries that have defaulted, Chad, Ethiopia, Ghana, Zambia. Kenya has technically defaulted, though it is not considered a default. But if you do speak to creditors, if you do speak to bondholders, they considered the issue of the Eurobond in February this year as a technical default. But they would not say that publicly. But if you do speak to them, they will actually say that. But what is even more worrying is that the number of least developed countries has increased since the term was conceptualized over 50 years ago. And this is all under the auspices of what were considered to be development institutions, what are considered to be poverty, eradication of poverty reduction institutions, or those institutions that are supposed to be policing the global economy. So it's very important to put into context just how disruptive these institutions are, how destructive these institutions are, and therefore we need to continue engaging very vigorously, very animatedly, and very purposefully at those spring and annual meetings. But let's take a bit of a deeper dive into the country level side. So it's nice that Emma and I are in sync in terms of our presentations, because this is sort of a very rough cycle, what happens at the country level. Right? You have the World Bank that lends to Africa. There are conditions that go with it. Most of it, sometimes there is an element of privatization and deregulation, because they want to bring in private finance. They want to bring in private actors in these development projects, whether they're energy, food, health, infrastructure, and so on. You've got all of its institutions that are involved in that project. So you've got the International Financial Corporation, IFC. You've got the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, which is like the World Bank's insurer, basically. And you've got the ICSIM, which is the Investor Settlement Dispute. And you have all of that happening at a time when there's fiscal consolidation and austerity. So the World Bank is, waits in the wings for the IMF program to talk about fiscal consolidation and austerity, and then picks up on the privatization angle of things, and then picks up those projects that are being privatized, and then brings in foreign investors to actually work on it. On the left-hand side, you've got the IMF in Africa. You've got conditionalities again, but the distinction here is that when the IMF is working in Africa, and in many of our countries, it is usually pro-foreign business, it's usually pro-creditor, and it is often associated with fiscal consolidation and austerity. So it's very important for us to know how these two institutions are actually working on the continent in very similar ways, but there are subtle differences in terms of where they emphasize their work and their projects. So just very quickly, what does this mean in terms from a governance and public participation point of view? On many occasions, I'm sure many of us on the screen here will attest that there's very low consultation with the public when the IMF and World Bank are in town, yet they claim that they do this. There's a huge subsidization of foreign capital through taxation, given the types of subsidies and tax breaks that are advised. Their presence undermines national institutions such as parliaments because there's very little consultation with parliament on certain tax policies, on certain macroeconomic policies. There's the removal of social protection buffers. So, for example, things like subsidies, cash transfer programs, these are often affected when there's fiscal consolidation and austerity. And so, we do witness that there's a potential reduction in the protection of citizens and an increased vulnerability to inability to access public services, inability to access things like education and health. And how does this paint in contrast with our current debt crisis, the continent? Situation here where you've got countries in Africa, you've got 7 countries in Africa that are paying more in debt service interest than they're investing in education. You've got 25 African countries that are paying more in debt service than they're investing in health. And you've got about 5 countries that are paying more in debt service than they're in public investments, such as infrastructure, electricity, and so on. And these are a direct result of what is happening when our governments are engaging in IMF and World Bank. So we need to pay very close attention during the spring and annual meetings when we are engaging and make sure we bring these statistics and these realizations to that. I'll just finish off by saying that, as we engage also, it's about accountability, it's about participation, but most importantly, it's about the agency of the continent when we're engaging in the IMF and annual meetings. We want to continue ensuring that Africa is a role maker. And even though we do get marginal increases in voice, we need to make sure we maximize that voice. But we must also remember that these institutions are not as democratic as we perceive them to be. So even though we do get these marginal progresses or marginal appointments, like an additional executive director, it doesn't mean that fundamentally the governance and the democratic process of decision making has changes a lot in these institutions. And so we do need to look towards an alternative. And many of us on this call, Emma, Martin, myself, and many other comrades, always advocate for a more democratic governance process to be held under the auspices of the United Nations, where African voices are considered on an equal basis, because it's a one country, one vote approach to some of these decision makings.